All right, sorry. The power of technology and the power of having too many open screens. I apologize, everybody. I'm so excited for the concluding session. We've got a phenomenal moderator for this session. Emiko Terazono has been covering alternative proteins for the Financial Times, which is the world's leading global business publication for the last 3 years. And we have some of the absolute pioneers of alternative proteins. But Emiko, we're delighted to have you, and I will let you introduce them. So thank you so much for being a part of the GFI conference, and thank you for your wonderful coverage of alternative proteins for the Financial Times over the last 3 years.
Thanks, Bruce, for some kind words. And welcome everybody in the audience for the final session of the day. So this session will look back on the last 5 years of alternative proteins, and we're going to try and gaze into our crystal ball to see what lies in the future. For our session today, we'll hear from Magi Richani. She's the founder and CEO of Nobell Foods, which makes plant-based cheese, but with a twist, not as we know it. We also have Valeti, the cardiologist turned alt-meat entrepreneur. He's the CEO and founder of Upside Foods, formerly known as Memphis Meats. And we're supposed to have Mark Post. He's the man who brought us the first lab-grown burger in 2013. We'll see, he's having a few tech problems, and here he is. Hooray, Mark!
Yeah, I was in the waiting room for the entire time, but somebody had to.
Great. So I guess, well, thank you, Bruce, for the introduction.
I'm thrilled that you're here, Mark. I was your stand-in, and it would have been a pale stand-in indeed. So I'm thrilled that you're here, and I will sign off and enjoy the conversation.
So great to have you all here on the panel. So I'm going to ask a round of questions for everyone. I'm hoping that members of the audience will ask questions as well. We want to make it a very interactive panel because we've got some really fantastic people here. So I just wanted to ask each of you just to look back on your 5 years and involvement in alt meats and also give a brief overview of what you actually do or doing at the moment, just so people can catch up. Mark, why don't you start? I think you're on mute. Maybe you can unmute yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Emiko. Yeah, this is called 5-year history, but actually I started in 2007, so that's quite some time ago, like 11 now. I can't believe it. It's gone so fast. And at that time, it started with a crazy idea of a relatively crazy guy who thought this should be possible to make meat from stem cells. And gradually, a couple of us became accustomed to the idea and started to warm up and start to develop this. And through a couple of lucky strokes, we were able to present kind of the first hamburger from that was actually made this way. And that, although that was not really at that time realized by us, at least not by me, was kind of a landmark event that started a lot of this activity, at least in the cultured meat space, cultivated meat space. Of course, there are many other aspects of cellular agriculture. And so that was, somewhat intentional, but still the impact of it was heavily underestimated by us. So I'm really delighted to see that this field took off with now over 80 companies working in this. And this is kind of exponentially growing, which to me is a much firmer assurance than back in 2013 that this is actually going to happen, and that we will reap the benefit of all those hard years of work, and get finally to a solution where we can satisfy the craving for meat of 95% of the people without damaging the planet or animals.
So, Mark, you're now the Chief Science Officer for Mosa Meat, and you're continuing the journey. Why don't you tell us a bit about your name change, for instance, and bring us up to speed on Upside Foods.
Yeah, certainly. It's a delight to be back at the GFI annual conference, and it's my favorite conference to look forward to. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I joined some of the sessions earlier today, and really exciting to see where this field is going. Briefly, I'm a cardiologist. I trained at the Mayo Clinic, and ever since I was a child, I grew up in a meat-eating family and loved eating meat, but didn't really like how it came to the table. So I have to say that I think, in the back of my mind, I was always in search for how do you get meat on the table that you can get behind in a way that is great for us, also for the animals on the planet. And much of this was very serendipitous. I was training at the Mayo Clinic, and in 2005, I was working on stem cells. And at that time, we were using stem cells to think about injecting them into patients' hearts, regrow heart muscle. And later on in my practice, I was doing that. And that's really where the idea came from. Could you grow food from cells? And once it got into my head, it was really hard to get it out. And look, I grew up in India. I didn't have any idea that this was also a crazy idea brewing in the head of William Van Leeuwen that Mark Post referred to, and had started out the In Vitro Meat Foundation. So I wrote to them a few times and said, hey, I'd love to talk about how to do this. For whatever reason, I didn't, we didn't manage to connect, but I did connect to Jason Matheny, who founded New Harvest. And we tried to get this idea out, encourage a lot of academics to start companies in this space. But at that point, no one was really ready to take that risk. And I was on the board of New Harvest and was really frustrated that it was not moving to the real world. Mark did the burger demonstration in 2013, and that was a really great thing for the field. And but still, no one was coming and starting companies in this space, because in order to translate an idea like this into the real world, people have to take it into the real world. So that's really the origin of the idea for Upside Foods. I wrote to one venture capitalist in the Bay Area, along with my co-founder, and we said, hey, what if we could grow meat from animal cells and bring it and put it on the shelves? And that seemed like a crazy enough idea, but nearly everyone I spoke to at that point said, no, this is a crazy idea. It should live in the lab, stay in the lab, and be a side project in the lab. It was in the realm of total science fiction, right? So, but there was a few people that believed it. And I would thank a few early investors, SOS Ventures, New Crop Capital, CPT Capital, and GFI that came along and said, yes, we want to be able to get this out. And it started off from a place where maybe less than 0.1% would even pay attention to it, to when we did on February 1, 2016. I think it's the same day that GFI was announced to the world. We presented the meatball, and that kind of took off. And that was the imagination, I think, that sparked the commercial development of this field. And since then, the idea of Upside Foods, really formerly known as Memphis Meats, was to bring our passion of being a force for good as we bring meat to the table. And the reason for the change in name from Memphis Meats to Upside Foods essentially was to quickly telegraph what the idea is about. Like, we want to bring upside to meat production, not spend a lot of time talking about the downsides, but really focus on the solutions. And that's the evolution of the brand as we get to commercialization. And then, what has happened in the last 5 years, we introduced the beef meatball. We showed that we could do multiple species, as a field. We introduced poultry, chicken, and duck. And now we're trying to lower cost and scale up production. So a reasonable amount of ground has been covered in the last 5 years. And like Mark said, probably close to 100 companies in this space going after this idea. And the field evolving around the word cultivated meat also is a pretty big development. Unmute, Emiko.
You're muted, Emiko.
Whoops. No, Bruce and Uma were laughing in the green room about how everyone was initially telling him how it was impossible, give it up, just keep it in the lab. So that was very funny. But Maggie, so you are in a completely different space. You started Nobell in 2016, is that right? And you've just done your Series B. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing? It's quite innovative, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Emiko. Yeah, happy to talk more about it. So our company was founded in 2016. We've been in stealth under the radar for the last 5 years. So a lot of people do not know about this, but we came out of stealth a couple of months ago with our Series B announcement. I started the company because it was a really hard problem for myself that I was trying to solve. Around 2015, I was starting to transition to a more plant-based diet. And one of the hardest things in the world for me to give up was cheese. And that's really something I hear all the time from a lot of people I know and my friends and family. Like, I would not eat any animal products if someone could solve cheese, right? So it was a really big pain point for me. And through my journey of changing my personal diet and trying what's out there, I realized that one, there's nothing that really hit the spot. And two, I did not want to accept that I'm never going to have amazing cheese in my life again. So I looked to start this company. What we do at Nobell is we make casein. Casein is the main protein that makes cheese melt and stretch and have all these amazing properties that we lack when we look at plant proteins. So we make casein from plants instead of animals. And the last 5 years, we've been developing the science and technology in order to successfully produce casein proteins, which are inherently difficult proteins to produce. So we figured out how to make these from plants. And obviously, it's a long journey. You're working with plants, you're working with science. And what I like, the way I have an engineering background, the way I like to describe science is you have to try 1,000 things to figure out what works. And you have to be very comfortable with failing all the time until you figure out what works. So that's what the last 5 years have been for us, is really getting the science and the technology to where it is today. And then in terms of the next steps, we can talk about them later, but really the focus, similar to what Uma talked about, is about scaling and getting the first product to market.
So what you're doing is you've created a GM soy that has this casein and grows this casein inside, isn't it? Which you use to make cheese.
Correct. So our plants can produce not only plant proteins, but they can also make plant casein, plant-based casein. So they can produce these casein proteins that we then take and use to make dairy products like cheese.
That's fascinating. Well, more later, but so I just want to talk about language. Uma, we talked about the word lab-grown meat. I think people have really sort of come into the idea of alternative proteins now, and plant-based meat has sort of gained acceptance. But we're still talking about lab-grown meat, and I, as a journalist, also, in my first, it's the shorthand that we use. And I know that the industry, you guys, the entrepreneurs, the startups, want other words used. But it'd be interesting to see what your take is on the use of language. And also, Magi, what's the shorthand for what you do? It's very, how does one describe it in very short words? Uma, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, certainly. Look, I think the simple summary is, what we're making is real meat. It is animal-based meat. And with food, it has to taste really good. It has to smell good. It has to bring you those really great, relatable moments that you have when you eat with your family or friends. In the same way, we have to always remember that the words also have to sound good, because this is food. And, when we start thinking about the evolution of the nomenclature for this, it started off with in vitro meat, and then lab meat, and then, clean meat, cultured meat, cell cultured, cell-based, cultivated. That's kind of the most common terms. Many of them are, representative of the stage at which those ideas were talked about. So lab-based meat was, again, 10 years ago, when almost all the work is being done in labs. What we're talking about is commercialization. We've built a production facility. We're going to start shipping product out of there. Just like a food industry, where you ship products out of a production facility, that's the stage we're in. And therefore, we think it's appropriate to now move into that stage. The second thing is, accuracy is an important one, because you have to be truthful in front of consumer when you're building a category, and when you're talking about a new way of bringing the same food that they know to the table. So it is a challenge. And therefore, there's we are really big fans to be very accurate. And in the regulatory realm, we've used cell cultured or cell based because it really says, look, these are animal cells being grown, and then therefore let's not mistake it for a meat alternative. I think that's fine in the regulatory realm. In front of a consumer, when we start talking about it, we're really growing cells, we're cultivating cells. We talk about growing them in cultivators. And it just seemed like this word cultivated has been coming and bringing people together to communicate, what the entire category is going to be about. So cultured and cultivated seem to be the most common preferred names for a consumer. My personal preference is cultivated in front of a consumer. I think there may be still some, debate on that. And hopefully as the field evolves, I would expect just like organic evolved over time into a name, cultivated is going to be that elevated representative nomenclature for the field. And it is truthful, it makes sense. And I think that's kind of where most of the arrows are pointing at the moment.
Okay, interesting. I'm not sure if I use the word cultivated meat, my editors will quite understand what that is. But Mark, what's your? I mean, you did actually grow or present a lab-grown burger. It's now not grown in labs anymore. It's out of the lab. Where do you think the language would go?
Yeah, it's I support much of what Uma has said. Same thing. You don't want to mislead consumers. So on the one hand, you want to call this meat because that's what it is, and calling it something else would be, in my mind, misleading. At the same time, you want to make sure to consumers that it's grown in a different way. You have to be kind of transparent about this. So some sort of qualifier does make sense. What is very noticeable in all the surveys up till now, these are, questionnaires. They're somewhat at the theoretical level. And a lot of these questionnaires was about what should it be called. And everybody kind of agrees that the current names are not particularly appealing. And the differences between all those, even if if it's lab grown or whatever, or synthetic meat or all those type of things, it doesn't really matter too much when consumers think about, is this something that we should want in the future or not? That's something else than what they're going to do when they are walking through the supermarket and get brands and packages and that sort of thing, and base their choices on those kind of visuals and language. So for the moment, I think we should just, to avoid a lot of the confusion, settle on something like cultivated meat or cultured meat. To me, as a non-English person, it's kind of the same. So I don't see really the nuances between the two. And we just should settle on it just to be, at least to be unified on what we're talking about. And one of the biggest interesting things that happened in the last couple of years, I think, is that there's now a lot of confusion about how this is different from, let's say, the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger, because they are kind of interestingly and smartly branding this as meat. And they said, well, this is meat. This is not a plant-based substitute. This is meat. And they are successful in branding it as such. And so a lot of people are confused now, how are these things different? That's in itself an interesting observation. It's not something that I would want in the future, and I would want to make a distinction between those, and I'm sure Uma wants to do the same thing. But it's an interesting observation that it's very easily confused by people. So yes, I think to be specific and most of all to be unified so that everybody kind of uses the same thing, that helps in eventually making that distinction so that consumers make a kind of more conscious choice of what they want to do. Other than that, this is all going to be at some point branded under brand names and may have completely different names than we currently imagine. So it's going to be interesting in the future.
Okay. Maggie, what is the plant-based? Is it plant-based casein? Do people understand? Does my grandmother understand what that is? What's
Probably
the
not.
shorthand for your?
Yeah, I want to just take a quick step back and say that in our point of view, what we call things is as important as the technology that we spend years developing. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that it's not just the science and technology, but it's the language we use. It's really important. And the other thing I want to also acknowledge is that this is a complicated topic, and it's okay to not have all the answers, right? It's okay to still think through it because it's a complicated topic. For us, the couple things that are really important is one, casein is an allergen, so it's really important for us, whether it comes from a plant or a bacteria or a cow or a goat, it's an allergen. So one thing that's really important for us is to be clear when whatever we call it or however we label it, to be really clear that it contains an allergen. So people who are allergic to milk proteins know that. The second thing that's really important is to also know that it does not come from an animal, right? That being said, how do you convey all that? How do you do that on a small package? How would you call that when there's such a small attention span, when you're competing with so many products on the shelf? That is something that we need to think harder about and figure out over the next few months. The second thing that I want to focus on as well is that in general, I personally do not, when we try not to use these words, and it's hard, but calling something alternative or real implies that it's not, there's a fake thing, right? And I think that the way we think about it is that we need to evolve the way we think. And what is real is what you're taught to think is real. Like if you grow up drinking soy milk and you don't know that a cow can make milk, then what is real for you is soy milk. It's not cow milk. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we also need to rethink how we use some of these more broad words. And really, for me, what I think when we start saying like animal-based meat or animal-based cheese, not just plant-based meat and plant-based cheese, that's when we start making movement in the conversation, because then you're kind of challenging people to think that yes, it's cheese and it's meat, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from an animal. It can come from other places, plant-based, non-animal, animal, whatever you want to call it, but to broaden that and not just to think cheese and meat equals animal. And that's really where we need to head. But the reality is that, we're still, non-animal cheese and non-animal meat is still 1% of the market. So we have a lot of work to do, one, to get more products on the market to increase the percentages, and also to figure out exactly how we call them, and how at the end of the day we can decide whatever we want. People are going to use whatever language they're comfortable with. So there's also that piece that we cannot control, and we'll have to think more deeply about.
I think language is also going to be a big sort of point where the meat industry and the, want of a better word, alternative industry is going to clash. So that's one of the reasons I thought it might be an interesting topic. We've got a question from Stephen Matsky. Sorry if I've pronounced the surname wrong. To Maggie, how does the cost of plant-based casein compare with fermentation-based casein? Both non-animal sources, but different approaches? ? And then another one, what are the cost drivers as you scale up?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. And I think one of the biggest advantages of working with plants is that they're already efficient at making protein. I mean, soy is the cheapest form of plant protein on the planet. If you have an acre and you want to get the most protein at the cheapest cost, you grow soy. And unfortunately, that's why it's also been so commoditized as animal feed, because it's so cheap and so high in protein. So I think that starting with a plant gives us a huge advantage with the economics. And without sharing the exact numbers, I think that we are targeting to be, at cost parity when we get to scale with animal-based dairy. So if you think of what it costs to produce casein today, it's sold at around $3 to $4 a pound, and maybe produced at a little bit less than that. And that's the target that we're in when we get to scale. And then eventually, I think it's ambitious to want to compete on cost with these products, but I think the real goal after that is to not just compete on cost, but how to even make it cheaper. Because then people choose using cost, price, and convenience. And if you can get the costs down, then you're even driving more incentive. You don't have to rely as much on people caring about climate change and caring about animal welfare, caring about all these things that a lot of us say we care about, but our actions don't always align with. So getting the cost down is really critical. And I think that plants, we as a company have bet on plants, and we believe that utilizing the fact that they need sunlight and that they grow well and they're very efficient to grow and high in protein, we're able to get to this cost structure where eventually we can undercut the $3 a pound price point that we're going after.
I just there was a question from Aman. Dr. Post and Dr. Valeti, what is your take on the FDA discussing if alt meat should be called meat? Mark?
Well, I guess I already answered that. In my mind, it would be misleading to not call it meat. So I'm very much in favor to call it meat. But again, probably some qualifier needs to be added to that. But for a consumer or towards a consumer, I think it's important to be clear that eventually what kind of nutritional value, and Magi talked about maybe some other health issues with any foods. You need to be very clear and very strict on how you call these things. And meat is, I think, a good name for this final tissue that people are eating. So yeah, that would be my suggestion to the USDA.
Uma?
Yeah, look, I think I want to thank the FDA and the USDA in the United States for really putting focus on this topic, because ultimately, having the consumer not be confused about what they're eating is such an important piece, and how we communicate that in the language. They're taking a very deliberate approach, and they've moved very quickly in the last 3 years in getting this out, issuing guidance, and then issuing what is called ANPR and what to call in front of a consumer. Like Mark said, this is meat, and calling it anything else, I think, is going to be misleading. That is clearly, a place where we come from, especially because we meet the scientific definition of meat, we meet the legal definition of meat, and the real test is in front of a consumers. When consumers taste cultivated meat, it is meat. That's the experience of a consumer of recognizing over thousands of years what meat tastes like. So I think in all of those, we check those boxes. So, calling it meat with a qualifier that distinguishes that this is not a product of slaughter, but it is the product that comes off with the same bioavailability, the same nutritional features, the same organoleptic features. And just to cut to the chase, when you taste meat, you know it, period. I think cultivated meat is meat.
So let's just move on from the language issue. Commercialization. When can we actually eat it? I think I go to a lot of panels, I moderate a lot of panels. There's a lot of things that are going on, but as a consumer, it's quite difficult to get excited about something that you can't actually eat. I think I read somewhere, Maggie, that you are planning on bringing it onto the market in 2 years. Is that right?
Yes, Emiko. So I agree with you. That's why part of the reason why we chose to stay in stealth for the last 5 years is because we didn't want to answer the question when you're going to have a product 5 years ago and say in 7 years. So because it is hard to get excited and these things take time. I think that it's important to acknowledge that when you're trying to change something so fundamental, it's going to take time, right? It's going to take a lot of people, and it's going to take scale. So we are looking at bringing our first product in one form or another, in one way or another, to the market in the next couple of years. And we're focused on cheese, and hopefully, we're still figuring out the details of that. But that is a big milestone. And obviously that's what our entire focus is on right now, from closing the Series B to getting our first product to market. It's what excites me the most when I come to work every day. But the reality is that when you come up with these new technologies, you're building new infrastructure. You're starting, like in our case, we're making our own ingredient. If you think about it, we engineer our plants. So we are designing them from the ground up. Then we have to farm them. So we work with farmers to grow them. Then we have to process them, and we have to get enough generations in to scale the production, to go from having, 1 seed to a pound of seed to 1,000 or tons of seeds. So it's a process and it takes time. But the good news in our situation in particular is that once we hit that initial scale up phase, then because it's a farm product, it's really easy to just grow more acres, which is a great advantage that we have.
Okay, so I think you used the magic word scale up. I think that's one of the bottlenecks or issues, isn't it, Uma, we were talking about, to commercialization and cost reduction, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. I think scale is going to be the biggest phase that the industry is entering into. The last 5 years was all about proof of concept, showing products, showing a pathway and line of sight to cost reduction, and starting to build industrial scale systems that produce at a larger scale in a very consistent, fault-free process. The next 5 years is going to have to test all of that. So like Maggie said, this was not going to happen overnight, but the next 5 years is going to include companies like Upside and others trying to put production facilities up, start running them, producing meat, and producing a portfolio of products that could include whole cuts. For instance, in our portfolio, we have whole cut products and we have products that are blended products. Putting them out in front of a consumer and fine-tuning the production systems for each of those is the next step. And because meat is such a large addressable market, and there's a lot of it that's made every year, for instance, 750 billion pounds a year. In order to produce that, we need to have large production facilities, and there's no way around it. And clearly, the amount of inputs we need to bring meat to the table using the cultivated meat methods is less than traditional conventional agriculture. But in order to get to scale, we need to start shifting supply chains. So I think those are the two major things that will happen in the next 5 years. Production facilities being built in many parts of the world, and then supply chains adapting to actually bring the ingredients these production facilities need to grow the cells. And that's the phase that we have to go through, and that's going to require significant investment. Now, we're lucky to have a slew of 80 to 100 companies pushing the envelope. But I think when we look back 5 years from now, I think many of these will graduate to that scale that we're talking about and starting to supply maybe regional areas, smaller zip codes, and then starting to take the distribution to potentially a much larger population than we can at the moment.
And Mark, I wanted to ask you about the medium. Another issue with scaling up is and cost reduction is medium, or the feed that you use to sell base meat, isn't it? Have companies gone beyond using bovine serum, or have they come up with an alternative? Because that's very expensive, and also it's not ideal, really, is it?
No, it's far from ideal. I think every person who looks at this rationally has, from the very start, realized that serum is a no-go. Just because the reasoning is not there, right? If you want to reduce the number of cows, you eventually have no serum to grow cells. So it's kind of a very circular thing. It's just not going to happen. So only from that point, and there are many other issues, but from that point alone, everybody can understand that you will never do this. So I think I know for sure that some have just replaced serum and have developed serum-free media that are as effective or even more effective than media in the presence of serum. So that's kind of a station that has been passed, I guess. There's no issue anymore. That doesn't necessarily mean that the media that you create are cheap. They are traditionally from the medical field, from a biomedical industry, pharma grade, high kind of quality controls, and therefore expensive. That is not only true for the nutrients in the medium, but also for additional proteins like insulin and that sort of thing. So is there, so what most of the effort now, and I'm now kind of speaking for myself, most of the effort is into find replacements for basically the expensive components, not only real replacements, getting rid of some of those proteins, but also replacing them with other, for instance, feed or food grade substitutes. So for the nutrients, for instance, we are currently looking at just feed and food grade nutrients, taking immediately from fodder beets or from from peas or from other protein sources, and give them to the cells as nutrients. One very simple example, we use glucose that you buy from a biotech company. You pay like €100 per kilo, or you can just take table sugar, which you can very, very cheaply source. And they are essentially the same products. And you can actually throw them on the cells and it's fine with a couple of precautions. So I think I imagine that most companies are thinking this way. We for sure are, and I've been communicating this many, many times and advocating this many, many times, that for scale and for reducing price of those components, we have to steer away from pharmaceutical grade components. Again, both the nutrients and the proteins, and it for sure can be done. It requires a lot of optimization work and a lot of hard work and finding out a lot of trial and error. But if you put your shoulders under it, it's happening, and it's actually relatively quick. So I don't really have any concerns there, and also no uncertainty or where this needs to go.
There's been a few comments about sorry, were you saying?
Sorry, I was just going, if I may add on to that, I completely agree with what Mark said. This is a shifting of supply chains we are seeing that is important for scale. And those are the pharma grade supply chains becoming food grade supply chains. And that's just such an important component. But the part that I don't want us to miss is there is a really large opportunity for people in that area, the existing businesses, to start adapting and starting to support an industry that could be scalable, sustainable, and also, frankly, let us the ability to have meat on the table for many generations. So there's a pretty big opportunity out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's been a few comments about GM. So Maggie, your product is a GM product, isn't it? How do you envisage getting around? There are countries or regions which are quite anti-GM, like Europe or China. I guess that. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm surprised it took so long for someone to ask about GM. First of all, I want to say that genetic engineering is a powerful tool, and that if we are going to dig ourselves out of the biggest crisis we've ever faced as humans, we need to use these tools like genetic engineering. And inherently, there's nothing, wrong with it. I think the issues that we see are, one, it has been introduced in a difficult way, and you can use it to do good, you can use it to do bad. And I think historically, maybe we haven't used genetic engineering to benefit the consumer or climate, and we have used it in ways that have made it, not favorable. The second piece is a lot of people do not really understand that technology and how it can be used. So I think that we cannot change policies of countries, right? Like, we cannot tell the EU that you will now accept a genetic engineering product, but what we can do is start working with countries like the US and other markets where it's not banned or rejected, where there's consumers and people that really understand that we need solutions and we need to go and explore all the options on the table. So, in terms of how we're going to get into these other markets, I think that's to be determined. And if the policies, I believe that if you really, governments and people in power need to start looking at this as a more broad, solution, and not just a political debate and it needs to be driven by science and facts. And unfortunately, you know, it's not always the case. And I am hopeful that that is going to change with having more people become aware of the issues and having younger consumers that are genuinely concerned about the future of this planet.
Okay. There's a question from Deborah Brown for everyone, I think. What are your thoughts on direct-to-consumer versus ingredient supply as a business model? And over time initially, and over time for a breakthrough animal-free dairy casein product. I guess so B2C or B2B. I think there are various companies taking various routes, but Uma, do you have any thoughts on that? I would imagine that got something to do with your name change.
So ingredient versus a direct to consumer, is that the summary?
That's right.
I think the opportunity is there in both. I think because this is a new field, I think the initial companies that are coming out will need to have a consumer-facing moment to really make it the kind of opportunity that we want to see. So Upside Foods is a consumer-facing brand. We are planning to be a consumer-facing brand. We will have direct-to-consumer channels for sure. But in order to get to the scale and the distribution that we are looking for, there will be partnerships. We also know that meat is used as an ingredient in many other products that people use. You know, in the U.S. at least, you know, FDA has jurisdiction over products that have less than 2% of their, weight as meat, and more than that goes to USDA. So I would expect that also to evolve. Things like flavors and things like fats being added to other plant-based meat alternatives to get to a better taste profile. I think that's where the ingredient play will come.
Mark?
Yeah, it's quite obvious. I think that what Uma is saying is kind of the way that this will develop, almost inevitably. It is important for establishing the new category to have a direct-to-consumer type of approach, so to make people understand what it is and what it can be. At the same time, there are a lot of opportunities for using this as part of another food system, so as an ingredient, if you like. You still have to, where I kind of draw the line is that, for me at least, the ingredient, if it is an ingredient, it still needs to be a tissue ingredient and not just cells, for instance, because that's kind of a tricky situation where you get into, is there any additional nutritional quality that you add in the ingredient, or is it just marketing? I think that's kind of crossing a line where I would like to stay away from, and I hope others would do the same, because that's going to confuse the area.
I think what's interesting is that a lot of venture capital investors really like the B2B model, don't they, rather than B2C. They see that as a.
I can understand, because what Uma said is, you need to scale out at some point if you really want to have impact at a societal and at a planetary level. You need to scale out, so you have a lot of partnerships with companies who are going to produce this, who are going to maybe brand the products on their own. So that's I think that's the preferable model, not only from an investor point of view, mostly from a societal point of view.
Yeah, and commercial. Consumer-facing businesses are a tough place to be. Maggie, what about you? Where is Nobell going with the B2B, B2C?
Yeah, we thought deeply about this for 5 years, and I think that for 2 reasons that I'll go over, we decided that definitely direct to consumer. One is it's going to take many more years to get to a scale where we can have enough volume to even be able to sell as an ingredient. When you go and you try to negotiate an ingredient deal with one of the large companies, they're talking in huge amounts, right? So it's gonna take a while for us to be able to produce those huge amounts that we would need for a B2B model. The second piece, which is even more critical, is we're doing something new and different, and we want to own how we talk about it. We don't want to outsource how we talk about these new innovations to someone else, because we believe that no one is going to care as much as we do about how we talk about this and bringing this to the world. So again, we talked about a lot of issues like genetic engineering, like how do you call this, labeling, etc. Those are all complicated topics that need to be thought through, and it needs to be coming from a place of trust, meaning that people over time learn to not necessarily trust big corporations and to not trust what they've just been told. And I think that we as startups coming in on this mission, having very mission-driven founders, having grand visions and wanting to really be a force of good, we have the opportunity to talk directly to people and to bring them along the journey, given how complicated this can be and how not new and novel it is. So it was once we thought through, it was an obvious choice for us that we're going to go consumer first. That being said, there can always be opportunities in the future to be able to sell an ingredient and open up more opportunities. But the survival, the kind of acceptance of this relies in our minds on a B2C model.
There's an interesting ongoing study. I was just reflecting on what you were saying, Magi, and I agree with most of what you say. There's an interesting upcoming study where people are looking at what would be the most convincing for consumers, like a large company merging with a small company, or a large company buying a small company and having that product, and what would be most trustworthy for consumers. The results, at least to me, were kind of interesting, because there definitely is a role for large companies in building that trust for these products, because they have been established for a long time as producers of trustworthy products.
Yeah, Mark, I would just want to add, I mean, there's other ways as well, like thinking of partnerships and like Impossible Foods launching with Burger King. It's crazy to me when I found out, looking at some of the data, that people trusted that because they know Burger King and they trust Burger King, right? So there is a lot of unconventional, I guess, in my mind, logical ways to get this trust by partnering with someone that can help you, whether it's you're selling directly to them or a branded product through their outlets. But yeah, I agree with kind of the gist of what you're saying.
So we're past our time. It's just flown by. But just before we go, maybe one round of questions. So where do you all think that alternative meats will be in the next 5 years, and where will you and your company be? If you can gaze into your crystal ball and then give us a very short answer. Mark.
Oh gosh, I can start. Jay, yeah, it's well, five years is a very short period of time. So I think we all agree. Uma has said that already. This is establishing a new production method. Basically, we've done the calculations. If you want to replace entire beef production with a fermentation type of product, it takes about 1.5 the total volume of fermentation that's currently around. Think about all the beer, wine, all those fermentation, but that's quite a bit. So it will take a lot of time to develop that. What we will certainly see in the next 5 years, and we actually have seen some of that, is that the first products will be on the market at relatively small scale, more like in the service industry than in supermarkets, also because I don't see in the next 5 years that the price is really coming down to the level of regular meat, so there will be somewhat of a premium. But we will see in various geographies, we will see regulatory acceptance of these products and the first products hitting the market. So it will be an exciting time. It's not going to really have a huge impact yet on all the goals that we eventually want to have impact on, but it's certainly the first step. I have no concern whatsoever about consumer acceptance.
Maggie?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is getting product to market. And I think for us, in 5 years, we envision being in restaurants and also in retail. Obviously, we're still going to be scaling, but I do believe that it's very feasible to get there based on where we are and just the number of acres we need to grow to get there. I think that in general, there's a lot of companies coming in the space, and I think it's great because right now, again, I said this and I'll say it again, it's meat not from animals 1%, cheese not from animals 1% of the total market. I think it's great to see more companies and more innovation. I think that there is also, though, the risk that you get too many people doing the same thing, and we also need to be careful there because at the end of the day, then there's not differentiation. So we really need to focus on better products that deliver on taste, functionality, but also on cost. I think cost is big, and I don't think we're going to change the food system if we ask people to pay 2 or 3 times more, even 1.5 times more for their food. It needs to be affordable. So for us, 5 years to get to cost parity is what we're targeting.
Wow. Very interesting. Uma, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you. This is a fantastic question. Don't have a crystal ball, but here's what I think will happen in the next 5 years. Number one, I think regulatory approvals will be coming in the United States and many other countries across the world. Number two, I think consumers are going to start coalescing around a term, and we'll move away from this whole thing of calling it alternative or something else to becoming mainstream. I think number three, I think, is we're going to establish this as a premium, very desirable product category. I think number four is this is a wish, but I think it's going to happen, is a major government in the world is going to announce that their preferred meat is cultivated meat. It may not be the larger governments, but some government might. I think, and lastly, I think there is an incredible opportunity for existing businesses to get into this field, and we'll see partnerships forming, incumbents who you would have never thought would want to embrace this field, starting to embrace this field. So I think that's the next 5 years. There's going to be enormous amounts of training programs that will be established in every major university in the world to start training people to be a part of this field. And I think the average age of the farmer in the next 10, 20, 30 years will start dropping as opposed to increasing because this is exciting. So I think that's what's in store for this field.
Well, that's really exciting, and so looking forward to the journey and covering it myself. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, and the audience for listening to us. This is it. The final session is over, and I'll hand you
That was totally inspirational, Emiko. Thank you very much. I think you did an absolutely phenomenal job in a very brief period of time, covering an overwhelming amount of information. So, bravo.
Too short. It was just too short.
always too short. So much to cover, but yeah, I thought it was spectacularly good. And wow, what a send off from Uma with his predictions of the next 5 years. I can't wait to watch that again. But all right. So yes, thank you Emiko, thank you Maggie, Uma, and Mark for helping us wrap up a successful day one. Before we sign off for the day, just know we have an incredibly full plate for tomorrow. We are starting early with a virtual global field trip that follows the sun. So 5 a.m. Eastern time. For those of you on the West Coast, you can just stay up until 2 a.m. Pacific. We're starting off in Singapore, trekking to India, to Israel, to Europe, and Brazil. That will be followed by in-depth tech tracks, an ESG panel, investor and startup roundtables. One of the funnest things from the conference, the Pitch Slam. You are going to want to tune in for that. And session takeovers by our grantees, the Good Food Grants Program, as well as our Alternative Protein Project student groups. So GFI has 16 student groups, and it's called the Alternative Protein Project, and we will be hearing from them tomorrow. So thanks again to all of our speakers and moderators today. Thanks to all of you for tuning in and participating in the chat, and for everything that you are doing to make the good food future. For now, good night, good afternoon, good time of day, whatever it is to you. And we will see everybody tomorrow. Thank you.